And we are live here on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, also TikTok, talking week 3 fantasy football. Super excited about this podcast here today. We do it once a week, look at each matchup and who should be the highlight of those specific matchups. So let's get going here and stick with us. All right, so each week I write an article. I look at each of the matchups and who should be highlighted within that matchup. Who has a plus matchup that you can apply for fantasy football, you can apply for DFS. So we're going to go through each game and highlight one, maybe two guys in each of those games, starting off with the Falcons and the Lions. And it's cool, again, live here, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok. Kyle Pitts I want to highlight, and a lot of people are going to push back about it, but the Lions allow the 7th most passing yards per game and the 3rd most fantasy points per game to tight ends. Noah Fant, Colby Parkinson combined for 6 catches and 97 yards in the Seahawks overtime win against the Lions last week. Kyle Pitts has been frustrating. We know this. He's nearly droppable, it seems like. What's encouraging has been the 22 yards per catch in week 1. We know the athleticism. We can see it right there. 2 catches for 44. And then he earned 5 targets last week. So people forget that this guy was an amazing prospect, highly touted first-round draft pick, top 10 pick, 1,026 receiving yards his rookie season. I think week 3 in a plus matchup for tight ends for a guy like Kyle Pitts, this is going to be a Kyle Pitts week. Same matchup, I like the other tight end, though, Sam Laporta. In week 2, Luke Musgrave only caught 2 passes, but he took them for 25 yards against Atlanta. In week 1, Hayden Hurst was the standout of the week for the tight end position. He had a huge week against the Falcons. Hurst caught 5 passes for 41 yards and a score. Atlanta is a top 12 fantasy matchup for tight ends. Sam Laporta has finished as a top 10 fantasy tight end, back-to-back games, 5 catches in each of the rookie's first 2 NFL games. He had a solid 63 outing in week 2. I think Laporta, if you're looking for a streamer or maybe he's your second tight end, might be a better play this week than a lot of other tight ends, especially when we're looking at matchups. Chargers versus the Vikings. So Joshua Kelly, I can acknowledge that, the Eagles' offensive line is great, but don't let that take anything away from what DeAndre Swift did against the Vikings last week. 28 attempts, 175 yards, and a touchdown. Even Boston Scott in that same game was super efficient, 5 carries for 40 yards. Jalen Hurts scored 2 touchdowns, which we know the tush push gets him in there, but still, it was a great day on the ground against the Vikings. Joshua Kelly had a down week 2 with Austin Eckler out, but he still had 14 touches. So that's the guy when Eckler is not in the mix. Week 1, Kelly rushed 16 times for 91 yards and a score, and that was with Austin Eckler also playing and on the field. So I feel like this week is a good bounce-back week for Joshua Kelly as a lead back for the Chargers. Kirk Cousins, one of my starts of the week. The Chargers allowed the most passing yards per game at 333. And are the second best fantasy matchup for quarterbacks. Ryan Tannehill threw for 246 and a touchdown last week. Tua Tagovailoa went completely off against the Chargers in week 1, 466 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. Kirk Cousins has thrown the second most passing attempts. Kirk Cousins has thrown the second most passing yards at 708 so far this season and is tied for first in passing touchdowns with 6. So coming off of a QB2 performance for fantasy football, I feel like he's hot. Stick with the hot guy. That's Kirk Cousins. He's going to be great in this matchup. Next, we have the Saints versus the Packers. Could be the first game for Kendre Miller, and it could be the first good game for Kendre Miller. Green Bay has allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 3rd most rushing yards per game this season. Bijan Robinson finished week 2 with 124 rushing yards against the Packers. The Saints drafted Kendre Miller in the 3rd round. Miller's been dealing with a hamstring issue, but he practiced, in full this week, which was good to see. Alvin Kamara is obviously suspended. Jamal Williams out. Miller rushed for 1,399 yards and 17 touchdowns last season at TCU and is lined up to have a plus matchup in his first matchup with minimal competition for touches. The Saints are tough. It's a tough matchup to really highlight somebody for Green Bay. I do just want to say that I have liked Jaden Reed a lot. I tried in most of my rookie drafts to go and grab Jaden Reed, especially when he was falling. Second round draft pick by Green Bay. He was targeted 8 times. He only caught 4 of them, and 2 of those 4 catches ended up being touchdowns. So it's like you keep splitting everything in half. He had 8 targets. He only caught 4. 2 were touchdowns. But I think having a big week, some people will say, oh, well, that's an outlier. Well, he still earned 8 targets, right? For one. For two, I think when you have a big game, the potential for you to be a big piece of that playbook is higher, right? It just makes sense. So highlighting Jaden Reed, maybe not as the best play because it's not the greatest matchup, but I think it's important to note these things. The Texans versus the Jaguars. So CJ Stroud, I want to highlight him. Jacksonville allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season, 8th most passing yards per game. Patrick Mahomes threw for 305 and 2 touchdowns last week. Anthony Richardson threw for 223 yards in his NFL debut. He scored through the air and on the ground in that game against the Jaguars. CJ Stroud currently has the 3rd most passing attempts in the NFL and the 4th most passing yards through 2 weeks. In week 2, Stroud threw for 384 and 2 touchdowns. Houston is letting this guy sling it. And weapons like Nico Collins, Tank Dell, they're emerging this year. Stroud has, been questionable this week, but he's good to go. All signs are pointing to him to have another good week. Same matchup. Travis Etienne. Last season, Houston was the worst defense at stopping the run and slowing down running backs for fantasy football. This season, Houston ranks 8th in fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. Zach Moss rushed for 88 yards and a touchdown last week against Houston. Week 1, Houston allowed 3 running back touchdowns. Down week 2 for Travis Etienne, but in week 1, he rushed 18 times for 77 yards and a touchdown. Also caught all 5 of his targets. I think it's a bounce back week for Travis Etienne. The Broncos versus the Dolphins. I want to highlight Javonte Williams. The Dolphins allow the 5th most rushing yards per game and 4th most fantasy points per game. This season, Ramondre Stevenson scored a rushing touchdown last week against Miami. And in week 1, I mentioned it already, Austin Eckler and Joshua Kelly combined for 208 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Javonte Williams has had a slow start to 2023, which we kind of expected. We didn't even know if he was going to play initially, week 1. But he touched the ball 17 times in week 1 of this season, 14 times in week 2, again, after injury concerns. 6 targets for Williams in week 1 with Samaje Perine on the roster is also appealing to me. Week 3 could be the first that makes us remember what rookie Javonte Williams did, back weeks 12 through 14 in 2021, where he scored 20-plus fantasy points in all of them. I think people forget how good this guy actually was. Raheem Mostert on the other side of the ball. The Broncos allowed the 9th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. In week 2, Brian Robinson rushed for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Broncos, which is largely what has skewed this fantasy average, but it still just happened. Raheem Mostert has played 73% of the snaps in both week 1 and week 2. Mostert has finished as the running back 18 and then the running back 5 for fantasy football the last 2 weeks. Week 2, he had a monster 18 for 121 rushing yards and 2 touchdown game. 19 touches last week, I think, just shows he's the guy. So even if Devon Achane, the rookie, comes in plays, I think that it's not going to be to the extent to where Mostert now is not touching the ball enough. I think healthy Mostert is going to touch the ball a lot for Miami. Next game of the slate, Titans versus the Browns. I just want to talk about Elijah Moore in this one. Last season, the Titans were the most friendly wide receiver matchup for fantasy football. In 2023, the Titans are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 5th most passing yards per game. So last year, they were a great matchup for wide receivers. It's looking like the same this year. Amari Cooper was questionable heading into last Monday's game, so this past Monday's game against the Steelers. Then he's continuing to deal with a shoulder and groin issues. So while a lot of people will say, well, he still has been playing good and heavily targeted, Elijah Moore only trails Amari Cooper 16-17 when it comes to targets this season. In week 1, Moore caught 3 balls for 43 yards. I'm a true believer in what we saw in his rookie season when I'm talking about Elijah Moore. I'm a true believer at what he did as a prospect. I'm a true believer that Cleveland is the place that he gets right and he turns his career around, and I like this matchup. I like him to do it this week. The Bills versus the Commanders. So Stephon Diggs. The Commanders are allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. Rookie Marvin Mims Jr. finished week 2 with 113 receiving yards and a touchdown. And Brandon Johnson, who I'm going to be honest, didn't know much about, finished with 66 yards and 2 touchdowns against Washington for the Broncos. Stephon Diggs has been targeted 13 and 7 times in the first 2 weeks. He finished with 102 and 66 yards. You are obviously starting Diggs every week for fantasy football, but this might be a good DFS plug for the week. Brian Robinson in week 1, Breece Hall rushed for 127 yards against Buffalo. In week 1, Brian Robinson rushed the ball 19 times and then 18 times in week 2. So he's touching the ball at a very consistent level. Week 2 was Robinson's best fantasy score of his career. He finished with 28.9 fantasy points as the week's running back 1. Robinson rushed for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns last week. He is the clear Washington running back 1 with Antonio Gibson not really involved. The Colts versus the Ravens. So Michael Pittman Jr., the Ravens allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game this season to wide receivers. T. Higgins, one of my best hits of last week, caught 8 passes for 89 yards and 2 touchdowns last week against Baltimore. In week 1, Nico Collins caught 6 passes for 80 yards against the Ravens. So Anthony Richardson is not going to be playing in this one, unfortunately, with that concussion. It's going to be Gardner Minshew. Regardless of who the quarterback is, Michael Pittman Jr. is the focal point of this offense. He is. There's no Jonathan Taylor. 23 targets for Pittman is 11 more than any other player on the team right now, and he is the 4th highest targeted wide receiver on the year so far. So volume, matchup, Michael Pittman Jr. Zay Flowers. The Colts allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 4th most passing yards per game through 2 weeks. Last week, Nico Collins finished the Colts game with 146 yards and a touchdown. Robert Woods with 74 receiving yards. Tank Dell with 72 receiving yards and a touchdown. Calvin Ridley caught 8 balls for 101 receiving yards and a touchdown in week 1. All of this against the Colts. Zay Flowers is leading Baltimore with 15 targets so far this season with double-digit fantasy scoring in back-to-back weeks. Flowers finished week 1 with 76 receiving yards, and he averaged 15.5 yards per catch in week 2. I like Zay Flowers a lot this week. Patriots versus the Jets. Hunter Henry, the Jets are allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to tight ends. Jake Ferguson scored a touchdown against the Jets last week, and then Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox combined for 7 catches against them in week 1. Hunter Henry is finished as the tight end 1, and then the tight end 2 so far the last 2 weeks for fantasy football. 13 total targets this season. In both of those games, he had over 50 receiving yards and scored a touchdown in them. So I think you ride the hot hand with Hunter Henry in a great matchup. Other side of the ball, I'm going to talk about Dalvin Cook, and I know a lot of people will say Breece Hall's better and, all of this stuff, but the Patriots have allowed the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. And Raheem Mostert just rushed for 121 yards and 2 touchdowns against them last week, which we talked about. Dalvin Cook has attempted 17 rushes to Breece Hall's 14, and he has 4 catches to Hall's 1. So, yes, Hall has been more efficient, without a doubt, but he's floated between 31 and 34% of the snaps the last 2 weeks, and Dalvin Cook's played 50% and 36%. So I'm not sure New York will force Hall into volume this week, especially if this game is not going to go the way they want it to. I think that, when you got a young sophomore, second-year running back who's coming off of an ACL injury, I think you're going to give the veteran and Dalvin Cook more work each week. And it's not to say that Breece Hall won't do more with his work, but I think that Dalvin Cook is going to touch the ball more pretty consistently, at least for the opening couple weeks of the season. And hopefully in this matchup, if you roster Dalvin Cook, that it translates to something useful for fantasy football. Panthers versus Seahawks. Miles Sanders. The Seahawks allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs, with David Montgomery rushing for 67 yards and a touchdown last week. Kyron Williams combined with Cam Akers in week 1 for 3 touchdowns. Bryce Young has been ruled out, so we have Andy Dalton under center. Miles Sanders has yet to have a good fantasy week, but he's touched the ball 22 and 17 times in his first 2 games. This week could be Sanders finally having his first good game in a Carolina Panthers uniform, and I think he follows the trend of touchdowns against the Seahawks, and he scores this week. Same game, Kenneth Walker III. The Panthers allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to running backs and 8th most rushing yards per game through 2 weeks. Tony Jones Jr. rushed for 2 touchdowns last week, and Bijan Robinson combined with Tyler Algier for 131 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns in week 1 against Carolina. There was fear that Zach Charbonnet was going to cut into Kenneth Walker's workload, but KW the third played 63% and 61% of the snaps and has logged 16 plus touches in both of his first two games. Walker rushed for 64 yards in week 1, and then he rushed for 2 touchdowns in week 2. I think he has a big day against Carolina, and he finds the end zone again. The Bears versus the Chiefs. This is touchy talking about it as a Bears fan, but I think the Chiefs running back, if it's Isaiah Pacheco, the lead back, I think that Chicago, just to make this one short, has been terrible against running backs. Last year they struggled against running backs. This year, Rashad White, 73 yards and a score. Aaron Jones scored both a rushing and a receiving touchdown against the Bears. So having a starting running back this season against the Bears just seems to be translating well for fantasy football. Justin Fields, this is going to be the only one that I talk about that I don't have like all these big matchup data and facts about Justin Fields. Every once in a while, I'm going to run with a narrative and a feeling. I just have a feeling this week with Justin Fields. My feeling is that Justin Fields gets right this specific week against the Chiefs, the Super Bowl winning Chiefs. This is the Justin Fields that scored the 5th most fantasy points last season, or the 6th most. The same Fields who averaged 24.8 fantasy points per game last season when the playbook was geared towards his strengths. That was week 6 through 18. It took 6 weeks last year for the Bears to figure it out. Unfortunately, and a lot of it's on Justin Fields. I 100% believe that a lot of it is on Justin Fields, but the playbook is not centered around Justin Fields, and it's showing. They're not playing to his strengths. It took them 6 weeks last year to actually do that. So he's voiced his frustrations with the media, his coaching staff, and himself. I think that this week, Chicago realizes, hey, we got to make sure that our playbook, again, is focused on what Justin Fields does well, design some runs, make the shorter plays. We can have the deeper shots, but we got to make sure that it's surrounded around Justin Fields. So I think, and I'm going to say it, I think that Justin Fields gets right against the Chiefs, which is a game they're probably going to have to chase. Cowboys versus the Cardinals. Dak Prescott, the Cardinals are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season, with Daniel Jones and Sam Howell combining for 593 passing yards plus rushing yards. So total scrimmage yards, I guess, through the air and on the ground, and 5 touchdowns against them the last 2 weeks. So again, those 2 quarterbacks combined doing good stuff against the Cardinals. Dak Prescott has yet to have a big fantasy week, but 255 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns last week is at least a trend in the right direction. This Arizona matchup presents Dak with a good matchup to have a good day. Zach Ertz on the other side of the ball. The Cowboys have been a terrible matchup, so it's tough to really boost somebody for fantasy football this season. They've allowed just 10 points through 2 weeks. They're a great defense. Zach Ertz, though, I want to talk about him. He seems to be the favorite target of Joshua Dobbs. He's an easy outlet for a bench quarterback, a second-string quarterback. 18 targets through 2 games is solid for Zach Ertz. He might just see 10 in this game. Dobbs is not going to be successful against the Cowboys defense, just chucking it down the field, in my opinion. I think Zach Ertz is a guy that should be rostered in most leagues, just seeing the target volume and just seeing that, what do we want for fantasy football? Our tight ends to see consistent target volume. All right, Sunday Night Football, last game we'll talk about, the Steelers versus the Raiders. Here's another guy that I'm going to be speaking on a bounce-back game for. It's going to be Najee Harris. The Raiders allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, with James Cook rushing for 123 yards last week and Damian Harris combining with Latavius Murray for 2 rushing touchdowns against them. Javonte Williams also averaged 4 yards per carry in week 1 against the Raiders. Everybody seems to be out on Najee Harris, who has done nothing special for fantasy football so far this year. And I think a lot of people are enamored with Jaylen Warren and what his maybe efficiency looks like. Harris has still played 52 and 57% of the snaps, but he's nearly split the work in total touches with Jaylen Warren. But Harris has averaged 5.17 and 4.3 yards per carry through 2 weeks. In week 1, the Steelers were blown out by the 49ers 30-7. So not much of a game script for him there. And then last week, him and Warren only combined for 16 attempts total. If there's a week to show us something, if there's a week for Najee Harris to give us something, it's this week against the Raiders. Same with Josh Jacobs, who's also been disappointing this season. The Steelers allow the most fantasy points per game this year to running backs through 2 weeks. brutal injury to Nick Chubb. That was horrible to see. I think we had somewhat of a positive note about what type of injury it ended up being, what type of tear. So it was nice to see that, at least for Nick Chubb, who I hope has a good recovery. He rushed 16 times for 64 yards, and then Jerome Ford took Chubb's role. He rushed 16 times for 106 yards in the same game. Christian McCaffrey rushed for 152 yards and a touchdown against the Steelers in week 1. Josh Jacobs has been awful the first 2 weeks. After having a monster 2022 season, he led the league with 1,653 rushing yards. So the Steelers are struggling against running backs. I think this gives Jacobs another chance here for a get-right game in this specific matchup. So thank you guys for tuning in. Week 3 matchups. I'm going to stick with the live stream here on TikTok for a couple minutes, but closing things down on YouTube and Twitter. Make sure you are following the Fantrax socials wherever you are seeing this, and good luck to you guys with your matchups.